afternoon and welcome to all of you who have come to our very special event here this afternoon. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Nevsland Center for Research on Russian and East European Jewry. We're very pleased and honored to have with us as our special guest for the afternoon Professor Robert Magocsi, and I will introduce him at length in just a few moments, as well as our second discussant or commentator, Dr. Samuel Barnai, and once again I'll be introducing them individually just before their remarks. Let me just say a few preliminary words. As all of you, I think, already know, the sort of reason or the immediate event that precipitated the organization of this meeting was to present and to speak about this wonderful book that has been published in Canada by the association called Ukrainian-Jewish Encounter, edited by Professor Magocsi together with Professor Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern, and it contains a wealth of cultural and historical information on what is billed as the Millennium of Coexistence between Jewish and Ukrainian people. This is a very laudable effort. Of course, I want to just give you a small taste from the opening remarks in the book by the two editors who said as follows: "This book was conceived by two historians of diverse origin who believe that knowledge and understanding of the Jews and ethnic Ukrainians as distinct peoples should replace the bias and prejudices through which for too long each people has imagined the other. In order to achieve the goal of mutual understanding, it would behoove each people to explore the other as a historical entity and as fellow human beings who are the carriers of a specific culture, body of religious belief, language, and social values," and so forth. And there is indeed a wealth of all of that embodied in this book. So first of all, I thank a great thanks to you and to your colleague Petrovsky-Stern for this marvelous book. I think it's also clear that the other reason why we are sitting here today is that we are all living during one of history's drastic and dramatic turning points, and it is in the shadow of all of that that we felt that it would be most appropriate not only to register our pleasure at the publication of such a volume, but also to use it as a springboard to open some discussion and some thoughts that grow out not only from this particular publication, but in general from the entire historical mess that we are witness to and part of, and so forth. I have to say that, personally speaking, my own family roots do not lie in Ukrainian lands, a bit to the northwest, but not too far, not very far. I can share with you one Ukrainian-Jewish encounter that I recall from my youth. Back in the mid-1960s, when I was about 14 or 15 or so, in New York, and for summers I attended a summer camp sponsored by a Zionist youth movement where we all learned how to be young Israelis. Well, it so happened that the corner of the Catskill Mountains where we were located, Ellenville, New York, was more or less the ethnic periphery of New York. We had, adjacent to our summer camp, there was an adult summer colony sponsored by and owned by black business people from the city who would come to vacation up in the mountains. And not too far down the road the other way was a Ukrainian camp. And once a year, in the middle of the summer, our big guys, in other words, the senior counselor staff, as well as the directors of the camp, all of whom were, in fact, Israelis who had been sent specifically to run the youth movement and the summer camp, big ex-army burly guys. We're talking about the mid-60s, somewhere like 66, 67, 68. And once a year, our big guys would play, the big guys
Football.
From, not football, would play volleyball against the Ukrainian camp. And needless to say, this was one of the highlights of the summer because it was, you have to understand that this is before we were all freed by consciousness of gender equality. And the idea of Muskeljudentums, and that, it was really important to display your athletic prowess as masculine people. This was something that apparently we shared with our Ukrainian comrades. And it was a big thing. We all came to this match, us little pishers, we sat around the side and rooted for our team, as, did the others. But I have to say that it wasn't just one of those friendly camp against camp sports matches that, this sort of experience, you could multiply it in the thousands, and it wasn't quite the same sort of thing, because both we and I dare say our hosts, because we went to the Ukrainian camp for this event, I think that a certain amount of foreknowledge went with this experience of playing ball against one another in a friendly way, in a friendly atmosphere, in a recreation atmosphere. And yet there was the sense, I think, not only shared by some of us from the Jewish camp, but probably also from the Ukrainian camp, that here we had an opportunity for the tough guys who had grown up in the same neighborhood to play off against each other and prove their manhood and to prove who was who. And again, my apologies for the chauvinistic gender references, but this again is back in the mid-60s. And I do recall, however, that we put up a good fight, but they beat us. And so that, and they were very pleased, I have to say. They were very pleased. And we were pleased with their victory, but we would have enjoyed winning. At any rate, that's my Ukrainian-Jewish encounter until quite recently. But now to get completely serious, I think there are a lot of issues, a lot of historical freight, a lot of interesting historical questions that need to be addressed, and some of which are addressed in books such as this one. What we're going to do is turn now to Professor Magocsi to deliver his remarks. Let me introduce him formally, even though I'm sure you all know him, and he probably requires little introduction, but I'm going to do my job as chair.
Due diligence.
With due diligence, exactly. Paul Robert Magocsi, who is the co-chair of the Academic Council of Ukrainian-Jewish Encounter, is professor of history and political science at the University of Toronto, where, since 1980, he also has held the professorial chair of Ukrainian studies. His PhD is from Princeton. He was a junior fellow at the Society of Fellows at Harvard back in the 70s. He has to his name over 700 publications, including 30 books. I'm going to read all of them to you now.
Please, don't.
No, seriously, I will just mention.
The numbers become worse because it's now 900 publications and 41 books, or 67 with translations. Okay. So please,
I'm completely out of date here. So let me just mention a few of the titles that I have written here. The Shaping of a National Identity, Subcarpathian Rus, 1848 to 1948, A History of Ukraine, The Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, A History of Ukraine, The Land and Its Peoples, and he is editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia of Canada's Peoples, as well as numerous other important publications that interest all of us. So, Professor, the floor is yours, please, and then we will follow up that with a comment from Dr. Barnai, whom I will introduce at that time.
Well, thank you very much because for your kind remarks, but also for all intents and purposes, setting the tone and, in fact, describing correctly what we want to do today, or what I would share with you, and then we'll have conversations and reactions and questions in which we can follow up some of these themes. So I was asked to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes as a kind of opening remarks. And also, actually, the book, in fact, becomes a backdrop, because I thought it might be appropriate to speak about two aspects of Ukraine that, in order to provide a backdrop for not necessarily the events that are occurring right now, because there is a war going on, but also a backdrop for questions that need to be elucidated or explained and are not necessarily known, certainly not by the public at large or even the media and diplomatic circles, but even some specialists. And that is the idea and or reality of Ukrainian statehood and the question of national identity. These two questions continually come up in discussions already. You know, what is Ukraine? Who are Ukrainians? And so I thought I would say a few words about these two topics as a kind of backdrop to a further discussion. And they come in the wake of or are derived from the fact that another kind of activity that I have been doing, which I try to not to do, that is enter the public sphere, but I had been called upon during the last 3 years to serve as an expert witness for the government of Ukraine, or through an international law firm in Washington, D.C., at the International Court of Hague, International Court of Justice at The Hague, for which I've had to prepare not one but two expert reports, which have been submitted now because the next step in this long case that began back in 1917, you see where I am, in 2017, regarding the forcible annexation of Crimea. And the second of these, I had to elucidate a few things. So we know that on February 24th, 2022, Russia launches this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is really a second stage of a war. It's not anything new. It's the second stage of a war that began in 2014. And it came in the wake of earlier pronouncements by Russia's President Vladimir Putin, with this now well-known, often cited speech, essay that allegedly he himself wrote and was given last summer, that denied the historical right of the Ukrainian people to a state of their own, and even denied that the Ukrainian people are in any way ethnically distinct from their Russian neighbors. I guess the overall thesis here is that the attachment of Ukrainians to statehood, as well as to a distinct national identity, doesn't come out of a vacuum, but rather it is the product of an organic development that spans actually nearly 4 centuries. And this idea of Ukrainian statehood, therefore, has a very long tradition, dating back at least to the mid-17th century, because at that time a Cossack state was created in the center of modern Ukraine, very specifically in 1649, and it existed either as an autonomous or an independent, first an independent and then an autonomous entity until as late as the 1780s. So well over a century we had this state on Ukrainian territory and considered by themselves as Ukrainian for well over a century. And when it was liquidated, this state, in the 1780s by the Russian imperial government under Catherine II, the idea of statehood was kept alive through the Ukrainian national movement throughout the long 19th century. And then eventually, if briefly, it was realized again during the post-World War I revolutionary era, roughly 1917 to 1920. On the one hand, we have the collapse of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and during this period, the establishment of no less than 4 Ukrainian states under 5 different regimes, chronologically actually, in one case simultaneously. And those were first a Ukrainian National Republic, governed by a Central Rada, and then a directory. The other one was a Ukrainian Republic of Councils, which evolved into Soviet Ukraine. The third was the so-called Hetmanate, formerly called the Ukrainian state. And then, somewhat simultaneous with this, but territorially different, a West Ukrainian National Republic based in lands that had formerly been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Of these 4 republics, in the end, after this period was over, 1917 and 1920, only one survived Soviet Ukraine. And that was largely because of its close alliance and dependence on Soviet Russia, which it then joined in December 1922, formally, not immediately, as you see, at which time to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But during this transition period, roughly from 1920 until, for all intents and purposes, 1923, Soviet Ukraine maintained many of the trappings of statehood, and that included foreign relations. And then until in the 1930s, it became fully subordinate to the all-Union Soviet government in Moscow. Point here is, Soviet Ukraine remained a distinct administrative entity, and then its territory was increased even further after World War II by annexation under the Stalinist Soviet Union. And then at that time, Soviet Ukraine's status was, as a state, was even enhanced, because in 1945 it became a founding and permanent member in its own right of the United Nations. And then in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union, when it entered this period of transformation, calls for a sovereign Ukraine increased until in 1991, as we know, it became a fully independent country. Now, after gaining its independence, present-day Ukrainian state adopted a constitution, 1996, outlining the structure of the state as a unitary, not federal state. That there was great discussion about what form it should take, and eventually unitary. But the question, nevertheless, even after the Constitution, remained open as to whether Ukraine was to be a state based on ethnic principles or civic principles. In other words, is this state to be defined by the cultural values of ethnic Ukrainians, or was it a state to be defined by the common identity of citizens, of all of the citizens of the state, regardless of their nationality or their language? And here we raise this question, and it's come up the question. We know that the population of Ukraine, certainly multinational, which makes it a normal state like the vast majority of states in Europe, which the exception perhaps of Ireland and Iceland. The question of language, identity, does language define national identity, or is national identity something else? And whether this new political entity that came into being in 1991 should encompass a population whose common national identity is based, as I said, on either these civic principles or ethnic principles. In other words, a civic-based nationality in which is clearly association with a state representing a community of people linked by common citizenship, living on a specific territory, and are aware of being subject to a common body of laws and political institutions. Or was this to be an ethnic-based national identity in which the state is associated primarily with a particular ethnicity defined by its language? The 1996 Constitution responded clearly to this question by defining, quote, the Ukrainian people as, quote, the citizens of all nationalities. So it didn't make a difference what your nationality, what your language is, that you are part of one Ukrainian people. Still, we're left with whole hosts of questions about the relationship between language and national identity. And so I would share with you this one last substantive point before we move on into the next stage. I devised a kind of categorization of types of identity in Ukraine, which may be helpful in then understanding what seems at first glance to be a complex issue. In this context, we can perhaps talk about 4 types of quote-unquote national identities in Ukraine. And these 4 types are organized either according to ethnic principles or civic principles. Of course, as in any social reality, these identities are not discrete or mutually exclusive. 2 or more of them may combine in the self-identity of any given citizen, but for discussion purposes, I've tried to distinguish 4 of these. The first of them is the ethnic Ukrainian identity. I mean, if I had a blackboard, if we were teaching an undergraduate class, we'd write all 4 of them down, but I'll mention them now and then go back and say a few words about it. One is the ethnic Ukrainian identity, which I just mentioned. The second one is the ethnic Russian identity. The third is a Soviet civic identity. And the fourth, a Ukrainian civic identity. So ethnic Ukrainian identity, ethnic Russian identity, then on the civic side, Soviet civic identity, and Ukrainian civic identity. So, ethnic Ukrainian identity. This is determined by the belief that a person is Ukrainian for all intents and purposes only if she or he speaks the Ukrainian language, identifies as Ukrainian, and believes in the idea of Ukraine as a viable nation state. Now, before independence, Ukrainianism, or this kind of identity, was strongest among the inhabitants of Western Ukraine, and in particular the historic regions of Galicia and Volhynia. But since independence, increasing numbers of young people in particular throughout all parts of Ukraine, and young in the sense of being born or largely acculturated in post-Soviet times, an increasingly number of these young people have embraced the ethnic approach to their national identity. So it's not only in Western Ukraine anymore, but in other parts of Ukraine. So the second of these ethnic identities, the ethnic Russian identity. This identity applies to those citizens whose ancestors were actually ethnic Russians and who lived for generations, even centuries, in the territory of present-day Ukraine, mostly, again, though not primarily, or I should say mostly but not exclusively, in the eastern and southern regions of the country. From their perspective, not only is Russian their primary, often exclusive language of communication, but their cultural affinity, often expressed through adherence to the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, their cultural affinity is to Russia, of which either they or their forebears were a part, whether that Russia was in the form of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. Now, the third of these, we move those civic identities. And here I have something called the Soviet civic identity. This identity refers to people often called Sovoks, who were born, raised, and educated anywhere in the Soviet Union. Their language of communication is almost always Russian, which was the most prestigious language in that former state. And as a corollary to using Russian, they more often than not look down at Ukrainian as little more than peasant speech, not a language at all, and refuse often demonstratively to speak it, despite whatever language laws and guidelines that had been adopted by the Ukrainian authorities, which these people, Sovoks, openly resent. Now, these Soviet or Sovok types actually did have a national designation in their Soviet-era identification documents, but it was for the most part a nominal identity. That's because nationality, whether Russian or any other, was not considered all that important. It was association with the Soviet state and its cultural and political values that became the main characteristic of Soviet civic identity. But then, in the absence of the Soviet Union, Ukraine's Sovoks have looked to its successor, the Russian Federation, as their ancestral homeland to which they again might one day belong politically. Sovoks are mostly of the older generation. In today's terms, at least 50 years plus, found throughout Ukraine, but mostly in the eastern and southern parts of the country, and in particular Crimea. Lastly is the Ukrainian civic identity. The Ukrainian civic identity. This identity, people who hold it, view the state as defined by a set of shared values to which people of all ethnicities may subscribe. And key among those values is loyalty to the state and its interests, regardless of a citizen's nationality or language. And so from this standpoint, Russian language speakers or Crimean Tatar language speakers are as Ukrainian as are Ukrainian language speakers. And so it is in this context that one can speak of Ukraine as a modern, multinational, multicultural state comprised of ethnic Ukrainians, Russian Ukrainians, Polish Ukrainians, Jewish Ukrainians, Crimean Tatar Ukrainians, etc., etc. And so this evolution of Ukraine since its establishment in 1991, and in particular following the two social upheavals, the Orange Revolution 2004, the Maidan 2013-2014, what we see since then is that Ukraine, moving more and more in the direction of becoming a nation state, where Ukrainianness is defined primarily by the civic principle enunciated in its constitution that, as I said before, the Ukrainian people are citizens of Ukraine of all nationalities. So let me stop here as a kind of, opening statement, if you will, and leave it to you to decide where to go next.
Thank you very much. It's a heavy responsibility, and I'm not going to exercise it just now. Instead, I'm going to introduce our discussant, Dr. Samuel Barnai, who is an adjunct lecturer at the European Forum here at the Hebrew University, as well as at the Rothberg International School at the Hebrew University as well. And he teaches in the Department of Jewish History at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. Dr. Barnai received his PhD from the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I have the honor of having been one of his PhD supervisors. Thank you. Mutual Admiration Society. He's a research fellow currently at the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and he is a member of the 2020-21 Young Scholars Forum in the Humanities and Social Sciences on Racism, Anti-Semitism, Genocide, the Holocaust in its historical, ideological, and cultural contexts at the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. He specializes in large-scale studies of historical, socio-demographic, and cultural developments in East Central Europe and among East European Jewry. Shmuel.
Thank you. Thank you, Eli, for your kind introduction. And good afternoon already, everybody. And frankly speaking, we used to skip on the introductions, but in this case, it's worth to start from the first couple of sentences. I quote them. There is much that ordinary Ukrainians do not know about Jews, and that ordinary Jews do not know about Ukrainians. There is even more than Jews and Ukrainians do not know about themselves. As for the general public, here again, there is a considerable ignorance about those two peoples who live together for more than 1,000 years in the lands that today comprise the European country known as Ukraine, end of quote. So the target audience is quite clear, is the broad masses, and I would say broad educated masses for this book, and therefore And correct me if I'm mistaken, but I was extremely unpleasantly surprised when I didn't find the book translation into Hebrew. We have English and Ukrainian, but not Hebrew translation. So, shame on us. Now, the main concept, and we see it explicitly even in the title of the book, is coexistence. And coexistence has several meanings in different disciplines. Even I found some coexistence in math and physics. I'm not going to speak about it. I don't understand nothing in this, all these formulas, nothing about this mathematical coexistence. So what is relevant, most relevant for us are the usage of this term in political and cultural sciences. In terms of political theory, coexistence described as plurinationalism, which is quite close to what you mentioned by the end of your talk. Plurinationalism of two or more national, ethnic, religious groups, various groups, within a polity as an organized community. It could be entity, it could be even just territory. And the basic stone, the cornerstone of the theory is the concept of nationality, that nationality is plural. Which means many nationals cooperate within an organized community. And therefore, a plurinational state is actually the existence of the multiple political communities that assist to prevent the division of the societies due to recognition of the multiple groups within an entity. There is also a culturological definition of coexistence, so-called cultural coexistence theory. This theory explains how various groups of people with shared interests in natural resources may or may not also coexist sustainably, and the interaction among cultural groups with limited similarity and limited competition on the shared landscape. There are essential features for the cultural coexistence, and the scholars in this field, they emphasize the three components. First of all, adaptability, which means the ability of people to respond to changes simultaneously in various groups, but mutual adaptability. Pluralism, and in this case, meaning the people value cultural diversity and recognize the rights, basic rights of different people to live in the same place and share resources. And finally, the third point is equity. And here the emphasis on the existence or not of social institutions. And these social institutions, they have to ensure basic human rights to protect certain groups from being socially marginalized. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know, but the history of the Jewish-Ukrainian or Ukrainian-Jewish relations difficult to define as coexistence, according to all these criteria. So actually what it was, if not coexistence, I would rather examine them, those relations, as juxtaposition.
Juxtaposition.
Yes. Horrible English language.
Not at all.
Not me, just...
And besides, such big words are hard to pronounce for anybody.
Thanks God it's not German.
Right, exactly.
So this juxtaposition, which means placing, in our case, two communities side by side, and it allows to compare them and to show similarities, but also differences, which I think it's much more profitable in this case of dealing with Jewish-Ukrainian relations, just to see what was common and what was different, and how they developed on the same landscape, on the same defined territory, more or less. And now just a few words briefly about the current situation with the Jewish community and Jewish-Ukrainian relations during this second phase of the war. First of all, we are facing this tremendous consolidation of the Ukrainian political nation. Not ethnic, not blood, not religion, not even language, but political nation. Actually, hopefully, it paves a way to a plurinationalism. And Jews of Ukraine and various other minorities, including, by the way, the Russian one, they take part in this historical, political, and cultural process. And we, maybe here in Israel, we know better than in other places that the common struggle naturally cementing the society, mobilized, unified it. So, on one side, we see some very positive pluralistic development. On the other side, the second side of the coin is the reduction of Ukrainian Jewry. I mean, physically, number of Jews. How many Jews are now in Ukraine? You all want to ask me. No answer. Nobody knows, unfortunately. Nobody knows. Estimations. Estimations, yes.
Mean that nobody knows. At least people estimate.
Estimates, yes. Okay.
Everybody.
According to the census, okay. According to the census of 2001, the one and only Ukrainian census that we have so far, unfortunately, 2001, 21 years ago, there were about 106,000 Jews. Those who declared themselves. I'm not speaking about the law of return, the enlarged Jewish community, the expanded, the relatives, all those who came and say, okay, name, nationality, ethnicity, Jewish or Jew. But there were no other censuses since 2001. So according to some estimations, about 40,000 Jews were in Ukraine in 2020, more or less. Again, not expanded, not enlarged, not law of return, but 40,000. So it could be, I think, suggested that now we have less than 40,000 because of the wave of the refugees and the big Aliyah wave we have now. Just to remind you that by the end of the Soviet period, there were a bit more than 400,000 Jews in Ukraine, 450 maybe. The one may say, oops, what we have now, it's less than 10%. So 90% left, passed away. By the way, it's a very adult, to put it, middle community, as all the communities in the post-Soviet space, with naturally very low fertility and etc., etc. But does it mean that Ukrainian Jewry is going to disappear? In my view, no, it doesn't mean. But it depends on the result of the war, of course. And if Ukraine survives, and I believe will survive, and develops, as you mentioned, in the book, the European country knows as Ukraine, we may expect the emergence of so-called, I call it, fluid community, which means Ukrainian Jews, by the way, much more Ukrainians than previous generations that were Russified, or I mean culturally Russified, much more Ukrainian Jews, and simultaneously Israeli, German, American, whatever, wherever Jews at the same time, and living simultaneously in two worlds. And such a community may exist and even coexist in Ukrainian plurinational state. It could be the best backfight to all those who denied for centuries and still denies, and you mentioned one of them, the very existence of the Ukrainian identity. So to summarize it, I would say a millennium of coexistence, I double cast it. I cast it double. Millennium, I'm not sure that 1,000 years ago there were Ukrainians, Russians, and the Jews that existed in this territory were not exactly the same Jews as we see them during the last 400 or 500 years. Coexistence also doubtful. However, perhaps, and I am very optimistic in this way, we are facing now the first steps towards real coexistence in this plurinational society. So it's an idea for the second volume. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I will just, first of all, we have a lot of food for thought that's been put on the table, and we have ample time for comments, questions, brief discussion, and I will try to get around the table to as many of you who would like to speak. In the format I think most useful would be for us to take, let's say, 3 or 4 questions or comments at once. Please introduce yourselves, direct your question or comment to either one of the speakers or both, as you wish. Both Jews and Ukrainians are diasporized peoples. And that the questions surrounding relations between these two groups are questions that span political boundaries, span several continents, and indeed, you know, it's no cliche to say that we live in a globalized environment, and in particular, when we address these two groups, it may not be sufficient to be focused solely on how many Jews there are or aren't in the Ukraine, how Jewish Ukrainians have or have not fared under various regimes in Ukraine, but in fact to draw back and to take a somewhat wider perspective on certainly including North America and not only there. So those are my, you know, 2 cents just to throw in. And as I said, we'll go around the room briefly. We'll take 3 or 4 initial questions or comments. Introduce yourselves. Volodya, you can start and we'll go that way.
When you spoke about identities, 4 types of identities, so I understand very well 3 of them, and those whom you defined as Slovaks, I'm wondering, how do you see them, how Ukrainian Slovaks or Slovaks in Ukraine differ from similar people in Russia and Belarus, in Uzbekistan, I don't know. So why you need this definition of identity? And the second part of the question, what do you say of minority Ukrainian identities? And I know that you're, I mean in Rusyns and Karpata Rus, I know that the topic is close to your heart. So if you can say how you place them in this scheme of identities, I would be very grateful.
Ukrainian Jews who mostly concentrated, now the half of them are left, of 42,000 people of the ethnic core, more than 20,000 left, 10,000 of them are in Israel and 10,000 of them somewhere in Europe. About 60% of them intend to come back. That's one of the recent polls. And now we have here in Israel the recent study that we did in the Absorption Ministry, Immigration and Integration Ministry, that 2/3 of those who came from Ukraine, they said that we use Russian, and Russian is my language. So how you, Ukrainian civic nation, and with all these national values, would live with that?
And I hope I did jot some things down. I hope I remember. I'm not a multitasker in life, nor a multitasking thinker. And these were totally 3 different areas. But to the first question, one of these 4 identities that I spoke about, Slovaks, no, there's absolutely no difference between a Slovak in Ukraine or a Slovak anywhere in the former Soviet Union. They're all Slovaks. For all intents and purposes, these are people who actually fulfill the desire of some Soviet ideologists to create a new Soviet man or woman. And even in an analogous situation, a much smaller scale, was Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, you know, officially pushed and had national republics and so forth and so on. But after, what was it, 30, 40 years of certainly socialist or communist Yugoslavia, there were Yugoslavs, and they still exist to this day. And almost aggressively, they would say, "Excuse me, don't, I'm not Croatian or Serbian. My parents are, I'm a Yugoslav," and this means something to them. So that's what that's what I could have used the term Soviet, right? Soviet identity. But that already implies a state that you could, because the Soviet takes another kind of thing. It has to do with values and attitudes toward yourself, toward your fellow citizens, toward identities that you are given but do not want to necessarily accept. But the simple answer to the question, there's nothing special about Soviets in Ukraine as opposed to any other part of the Soviet Union, but I'm talking about Ukraine. So it's one of the categories, because there are Soviets in Ukraine. The other question that you raised about, groups, let's say, that in Ukrainian terms are an ethnic group as opposed to a nationality, Carpatho Rusyns. How does that fit into to my understanding of Ukrainian society? I gave you a list of various peoples who live within Ukraine and are all Ukrainians because they are citizens of Ukraine. And so just as there are just as there are ethnic Ukrainians, Russian Ukrainians, Polish Ukrainians, Jewish Ukrainians, Crimean Tatar Ukrainians, so there are Carpatho Rusyns Ukrainians. Just another one of these various peoples of the civic state of Ukraine. Second question had to do with Israel as a model. Well, you've both asked the question and in a sense responded. Israel is a model, and not in this case for Ukraine, but could be a model for many other struggling movements or countries that are faced with invasion. From this standpoint, that is, defending oneself and having the bravery and courage and willingness of self-sacrifice, Israel is a success story. I mean, any struggling country would, of course, too bad we can't be like them. They won. They exist. So obviously, it is the model of the moment. And it should be. And maybe, and probably is already, the rest of the world looking at Ukraine during a time of war with a president that, went beyond all our beliefs. Well, Ukraine is now going to be a model, for many other movements in the world, right? So, Ukraine already has joined Israel as models on the military side, right? The self-defense side. As a society, and moving forward, after there is no more war or hot war, because there'll always be war there, there'll always be a status of. But as a society moving forward, and then having to create stability within a territorial space. Here, Israel as a model becomes a bit more problematic because, as you know better than I'm just a simple outside observer, there are issues, many kinds of issues that are troubling in Israeli society. And of course, the relations between Israelis and Palestinians is still, an issue to say the least. One would hope that the Israeli example is something that Ukraine should look to and avoid. Because at a much smaller scale, different conditions, nonetheless, there are and will be a significant number of ethnic Russians living on the territory of Ukraine, and they have to be treated as full-fledged citizens equal to everybody else, and their cultural values must be respected. And whereas Ukraine has had a pretty good record, and in fact an excellent record, on treating non-ethnic Ukrainians within the state up until now, that has to be continued, and it will be continued. But you know, for obvious reasons, it's difficult if people are going to associate their neighbor with being Russian and then associate that neighbor with the invasion. Yeah, so this is a tricky thing. So in that sense, Israel a model now of the military, but not necessarily in the subsequent phase of state building or state recovery building or an socioeconomic building, etc. And now language. And without question, Russian is the language. I think you used the term ethnolect. Russian is a common, normal language for many people of Jewish background who come from Ukraine and who live in various parts of the world, including Israel. Your point about diaspora, absolutely. And there's a whole chapter in here on diaspora, by the way, precisely because it's not just the territory of Ukraine. But, so absolutely. But then how are people supposed to think of, you know, they speak Russian, they come from Ukraine, so what are they? Should they be associating as Russians or as Ukrainians or whatever? Well, the problem, actually, derives from how language was perceived in relationship to national identity. And that goes back to the Enlightenment philosopher Johann Friedrich von Herder. Herder argued, in his famous line, that the most important component of one's self and one's identity is his or her language. Is there anything dearer than one's native language? Now, the ideas of Herder were in particular influential in Central and Eastern Europe. Why? Because this universalist philosopher said that not only language was this supreme or main identity marker, but also that every people and every culture in the world has worth. They are all equivalent. They have something unique and different from anybody else. And if you take this then to the ultimate, the Kashubs are the equivalent to the French, right? Or the Cilicians to the Spanish. Certainly the Catalans are superior to the Spaniards, the Castilians, but be that as it may. So these two ideas, but in particular the sense of language equals identity, right? That got driven into Central and Eastern European national movements, and we have this problem until today. Because language does not equal identity. Language is one of the factors that can be used to identify a people, but it is only one of them. And in some cases, it doesn't play a role at all. So, I mean, are we going to say to an Irish person, despite all of the money and investment that the state has done, they had Israel as a model, they didn't succeed, they failed utterly, You know, are we going to tell an Irish person that they're English? Or is an Irish person confused of his or her identity because he or she only speaks English? No, they're not confused. We're Irish. Why? Because language is not it should not be confused with national ethnic identity. Language is just an instrument. It's an instrument of communication. In some cases, if you want to make it the ultimate source of defining yourself and your nationality, fine. But if we have to look around the world, it doesn't work. And in order to overcome the confusion that you've kind of alluded to, we have to break this understanding that language equals identity. Language is only it's an instrument and one of the many factors. And therefore, a Russian speaker, whether it is an ethnic Russian, whether it is a Jew from Ukraine, whether it is a Bulgarian from Ukraine who speak primarily Russian, or Greeks. I mean, it's not only Russians, ethnic Russians who is this their language, or Jews that this is their language. Many of these other peoples. You have to break that mental tie between language equals identity. And then I think things would become clarified. So that's how I would, I guess, answer those three questions.
Okay, just briefly about the Israeli model for Ukraine. It became almost cliche since 2014, not only Aristovich, many others. And I agree that in terms of military formation of the army, army industry complex, all this, it could be implemented in some way. We have to remember also that the Israeli model is actually itself based on Swiss model, adopted here and somehow adopted to the local situations. In terms of coexistence, I say please no. Please no. No way. We are not the best example for the...
The we here meaning Israel.
Yeah, yes. And by the way, also inter-Jewish relations also. And actually the structure, the targets are different. We hear in terms of creation of unified society. We had to deal like 60, 70, 80 years ago with the question how to combine in one society Jews from Belarus and Morocco, from France and Yemen, from Ukraine and Kurdistan. And it's not really proper situation in Ukraine. In terms of Jewish, non-Jewish relations here, I mean Israeli Arabs relations, we have to say frankly in 1948-49 the Israeli side actually did ethnic cleansing, not genocide, not mass killing, but ethnic cleansing in order to reduce non-Jewish portion of the population and to create the situation completely different. In 47 you have 2/3 Arabs and others and 1/3 Jews, and after the war you have like 85% Jews and 10 or something percent Arabs. I don't say whether it's good or not, but it's a reality in terms of Israel. So no, please don't use these examples. As a concept of identity and language aspect, and not only the scholar you mentioned, German scholar you mentioned, who saw the language as the only or the main, the most significant identity marker, it was also the Soviet approach. The Soviet census is based not on religion
and the Austro-Hungarian.
Yes, Soviet census is based on your self-definition and your language as you declare it. Mm-hmm. You know, I remember perfectly well. I was a teenager, so maybe I also kind of sabok. So, but in 1989, a girl student came to my home, and there was less Soviet census, and she asked me, "Your ethnicity?" I say Jew, and your language. And I proudly say, Jewish, not me, not her, didn't know about Yiddish and Hebrew. Mm-hmm. Yes. And my knowledge of Hebrew was zero, and of Yiddish was a couple of sentences that all my neighbors in my neighborhood in eastern part of Ukraine also knew it, and not being Jewish completely, like, you know, oy vey, gewalt, and all this story. It's all my Jewish linguistic background then in 1899. 89, yes, so, okay, but I declared it and she wrote it. Okay, so the Soviet approach to see in the language as a main identity marker, officially, okay. Now, what we see now, during this war, again, not since February, but at least since 2014, and I would say even in the pre-war, but also already independent Ukraine, very slowly, with one step forward, 2 steps back, but some process in which the significance of the language you speak, or the one speak, reduces, and the usage increases. And it's not only in Jewish-speaking, Russian-speaking Jewish communities all over the world, but in Ukraine itself and in all this post-Soviet space. I can give you an example. For many years, I have an opportunity to meet with various kind of politicians from this region, diplomats, and it was interesting if I look back 10, 15 years ago, when the official part was in English. And then in the couloirs, you speak with the ambassador of, for instance, Estonia or Latvia or Czech Republic or whatever, and mainly it was in Russian. Why? Because for them it was still difficult to speak in English, fluently at least. And it was easier for them to speak Russian, of course, the former Soviet Union especially. And slowly but generational changes, and you see now young diplomats, in terms of diplomacy, they are younger, they're 45, 50 years old. It's already difficult for them to speak Russian outside the official part of the meeting. Yes, so slowly we speak more and more English or kind of Russian, but very limited. Now, what we see now in Ukraine, interesting process, that the identity is defined more and more. I'm not speaking about non-ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, by belonging to certain church. And with certain church, the struggle
religious
between,
identity.
yes, religious, but not in terms of really religion. There is no conceptual struggle over the seeing the holy meaning of the Trinity, whether the Mary was virgin or not, or what say these and these scholars in the 5th century, blah, blah, blah. It's actually religious political process when you express, the one expresses belongings through this transformation, whether you belong to the PCU, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, recognized by Constantinople, or you're still in Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate. By the way, already not Moscow Patriarchate. Decision was to erase all definitions, all mentions of Moscow Patriarchate. And it's an unclear situation now whether they are independent or not, or whatever. But I can say that in 3 years before the February 2022, something like 550, 560 communities, parishes, moved from Moscow Church to Ukrainian Church, to put it shorter. And within 3 months of the war, of the second stage of the war, something like 440 did the same. So in 3 months, you have almost the same number as in 3 years before. Okay, and it speaks for itself. Again, it's not about the concept, about some religious, philosophical, theological issues. It's only the question whether our village, and by the way, many villages, if we see on the map, it's a Kiev region, Zhytomyr region, the eastern part, previously occupied for months by Russians. Some communities in Sumy and Chernihiv, significantly less, but many people in this region. After they had the pleasure to be under the so-called Ruski Mir for 1 month, they decided to be part of the Ukrainian church, independent church.
I mean, there's so much written about ethnic borders and boundaries. I, as an anthropologist, who actually worked a lot in Ukraine, with the Jewish communities in Ukraine, mostly Western Ukraine, I would be extremely cautious about using any of the metaphors, because essentially they're all metaphors: existence, coexistence, juxtaposition, symbiosis, symbiosis, anything, because they're all, like, if we treat them as interpretive tools, then we should be able to say what we, associate with those metaphors, and how does it work as a methodological apparatus. But in any case, all those metaphors, they present an external look upon two groups of people who happen to live together in a certain territory. But right now, and again as an anthropologist, I want to stress that there are as important internal divisions among different Jewish populations, no matter where they live. And again, I worked a lot with immigrant Jewish communities in the United States, and it's very important for them who is Ukrainian Jew, who is Moldovan Jew, who is a Litvak, at least for the people who were born and raised and lived until a certain age in the old country. So this division and this notion of a Ukrainian, let's say Ukrainian Jew, is very much alive, whether these people live in Ukraine or not. And here that's that's an association with what you said about the refugee communities. So it is an extremely important internal division, an extremely important internal notion inside the Jewish milieu. And my question, and you don't really have to answer it in full, but I'm still sort of suspicious about this four-partite division, with the Savok being the fourth option, because I think these four notions are of different level, basically, different cognitive level and definitely different origin. And also, if the first three, you can probably say this about somebody, and this somebody may apply this to him or herself, saying, yes, I'm Ukrainian-speaking, Russian-speaking Ukrainian, let's say, okay? Then Savok is always externally induced. No one would say, well, I'm a Savok, because it's largely a derogatory term, and I don't think it works well with the other three, to tell you the truth. And I happen to hear several times this word Savok used about people who were born after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in some sense, it's a type of mentality and type of action in the world that's heritable. So like you can inherit it from your ancestors. But I don't really think that Savok, and I see what you mean here, but I would not use this word in this scholarly classification because it sort of jars in your ear. It's sort of different from the first three.
Well, I'm going to have to ask a real quick question, and that is, okay, not Savok, what's the alternative? What's your suggestion for an alternative?
Oh, it's kind of being Jewish to respond with question and question.
Actually,
well, but this is true, because, do you have an alternative? I have an alternative, by the way.
right now I don't.
Okay, fine, so then what about Soviet? I mean, then that's. I understand that Savok it has negative connotations, and by the way, I use it deliberately so, for the negative connotations. But Soviet is more neutral, and it is what I'm describing.
Right, but that depends on what kind of material you're working on, how and who came up with this particular classification in reference to a certain body of materials and for what purposes. So I need to know more in order to.
Fine. Okay. I guess all I would say though on these things of classifications, all classifications are created. Right. And they are created by whom? They're created by the kind of people who sit around this table. What is the difference between Baroque and early Rococo? Well, and and Mannerism and Renaissance? Well, that's because some art historians needed to put some kind of order into this grand scheme of the evolution of art and came up with these terms, to classify an era. And then everybody else is saying, well, the person's not quite Baroque, or it's more Rococo, or neoclassicism. This is the normal problem of taxonomy, as you know. So, from that standpoint, I tried to create some kind of categories, and I'm not saying that these are the only categories. They can be other kind of categories as well, perhaps, in order to try to understand. It's not the be-all and end-all, because they are all created concepts. Now, leave aside from that, the internal divisions in Jewish society. Absolutely, there are internal divisions in every national group. So, I mean, East Slovaks have virtually nothing to do with West Slovaks, both in terms of language, both in terms of culture, but in conversation, they themselves and describing this country, we talk about Slovaks. We want to go a little bit farther. Every group has internal differences, and those internal differences also come and go. Note that in your commentary, you know, the term Galicianer. Now, this was quite evolved and especially in contradistinction to Litvaks, and primarily actually in the diaspora, because if you lived in Galicia, you didn't really care. You didn't have to distinguish yourself. Right, first time. Well, but I mean, certainly in North America, that term is not as strong as it was before, and it's going away because there aren't many Galiciana anymore. They're dying off.
But in some sense, it's stronger because
Well,
if you're in
well,
Galicia,
and okay,
everybody's
fine.
down,
Well, so
this
fine. But all I'm saying, these internal distinctions is
Right.
just a common phenomenon. But we still have to. If we're talking about, if we're trying to describe, as we are trying to describe Jews, we're not going to have our conversation and talk about, well, Galicianas or you know, Crimean Jews or Krimchaks, etc. We do use some kind of generalized terms, and then if we have to move on, then we become more specific.
I'm afraid we're going to have to run upstairs.